Turkey and Syria appear to be on the brink of a major military conflict as tensions escalate in the war-torn country. At least 33 Turkish troops were killed in a Syrian airstrike yesterday. It's the latest escalation of violence that we're seeing in the Idlib region near the Turkish-Syria border.
Idlib is the last rebel stronghold in Syria. It's where anti-regime forces and innocent people are holed up, trying to defend their homes from Russia-backed airstrikes and ground attacks.
أنا كنت في باب دكاني فتحت باب الدكان ودخلت طالعوا الولاد طالعوا الأغراض لبرا وعم نطبق ومنكنس ومنهندس وعم نقول يا رب الله يرزقنا ما شفنا إلا شيء دوب فقر منا نحن شو صار ما بعرف الدكان تفجر تدمر نحن تجرحنا بتاع الأمن على أبونا كلياتنا طيب شو في عنا نحن شو في عنا.
So NATO held an emergency meeting earlier. The U.S. and international community have urged restraint as the escalating violence forces hundreds of thousands of people to flee the region. Senator Lindsey Graham spoke about the crisis, calling on President Trump to help protect innocent civilians.
Very worried about what's going on in Syria. The world is ignoring one of the great humanitarian crises of the 21st century. We're all sitting on the sidelines as people in Idlib get slaughtered. I would urge the president to up his game, to declare a no-fly zone, to protect the women and children of Idlib from being massacred. The Russians and the Assad regime need to be held accountable by the international community.
The United Nations says more than 900,000 people have fled the violence in Idlib since December, but it's unclear how exactly the U.S. will respond. CBS News foreign correspondent Holly Williams is following the latest from London. Holly, you've been covering Syria ever since war first broke out there. What are you hearing is the latest from the Turkish-Syrian border? And why have the clashes escalated to this point where Turkey and Russia appear to be on the brink of a major conflict?
Yeah, well, I mean, Idlib is a part of Syria that is steeped in blood. Airstrikes by the Syrian regime, by Russia, targeting civilians, hitting markets, hitting hospitals have been going on for years. But that said, this is a serious escalation because it involves outside countries. It involves outside powers. And the very clear risk here is that it will evolve into an all-out conflict between Turkey and the Syrian regime, perhaps also drawing in Russia, which is a close ally of the Syrian regime. The 33 Turkish soldiers who apparently lost their lives last night in those airstrikes represent the single biggest daily death toll for Turkey since it intervened directly in the Syrian conflict back in 2016. And Turkey, for its part, says that it has hit 200 regime targets and neutralized, in its words, more than 300 regime soldiers. Of course, we have no way of independently verifying those numbers. How did we get here? Well, Idlib is the last sizable remaining rebel stronghold in Syria, and it is clearly a fly in the ointment for the Syrian regime and for Russia. And I think this latest offensive, which began late last year and has seen hundreds of thousands of people fleeing for their lives, is a sign that the patience of the regime in Russia is running out.
So you mentioned that Russia is supporting the Assad regime. And, you know, part of Moscow's goal is to sort of assert dominance in the Middle East over the U.S. and NATO forces there. But what about Turkey? Why has Turkey intensified its military campaign?
Well, Turkey has backed the rebel side in the Syrian conflict almost since the outset of the war back in 2011. And during those almost 9 years, Turkey has also absorbed 3 million, or almost 4 million Syrian refugees. And those people have placed a political, economic and social strain on Turkey. So when Turkey now looks at what is happening in Idlib, home to 3 million, maybe 4 million people, and the scene of this new offensive, the Turkish government sees the potential for another million people or 2 million people to pour across its border. And it wants to stop that from happening. It's also very clear that Turkey feels somewhat alone in this, that Turkey feels that it's been abandoned by its allies in Europe and the US. And I think that's why, once again, we are seeing Turkey threaten to open its borders and allow Syrian refugees or migrants to pour into Europe. And in fact, on Turkish media today, we've even seen video purporting to show a few hundred refugees or migrants crossing from Turkey into Greece and Bulgaria.
It's just so horrific when you know that innocent people are being used in this sort of pond between these great powers, Holly, where they have nowhere to go and they are ducking and covering from airstrikes and from indiscriminate bombarding. What is NATO saying about this?
Well, so Turkey invoked Article 4 of the NATO treaty, and under Article 4, a member state can request a meeting if it feels that its security or territorial integrity is under threat. That meeting was held today. NATO then put out a statement condemning airstrikes by the regime and by Russia. But it's a complicated situation because over the last few years, Turkey's had a very strained relationship with many of its NATO allies in Europe and in the US. And Turkey has actually grown much closer to Russia during that period, despite the fact that they're on opposing sides in the Syrian conflict. And for its part, NATO very clearly does not want to get drawn into the Syrian civil war.
So the U.S. has been reluctant to get involved in the Syrian civil war. The Trump administration pulled troops out of the area, basically saying the focus was to keep ISIS at bay. And according to the president, ISIS is gone, right? So there's no reason to keep U.S. troops there. But in the past, the Trump administration has followed up after perhaps the Assad regime was accused of engaging in chemical attacks on their own citizens. So could we see perhaps a re-engagement of U.S. forces in the area?
Well, I would first of all point out that ISIS has not gone in Syria, although they've lost basically all of their territory, and there are still US troops inside of Syria. When it comes to Idlib, I think arguably we are looking at the limits of American power. When you look at the diplomatic efforts to try and stop offensives happening in Idlib, none of them have had any long-term success. And if you think about what it would mean for a direct US military intervention in Idlib at this point, well, that could spell some kind of all-out conflict with Russia, and that would be enormously dangerous.
Holly, before we wrap up with you, I just want to ask you again about the refugee crisis. It's always heartbreaking to me to see the video that you and your crew shoot sometimes of these refugees. And I don't know if we should thank the heavens that children, even in the midst of a crisis like this, even surrounded by the death and the bombarding and the attacks, that they're still sometimes playing and enjoying just being a child. And then you have alongside of them worried parents and relatives who realize how dangerous the situation is. What have they told you over the course? Here are these images of these little children that we're showing now, Holly. What is your experience in talking to these individuals about their hope for the future?
Yeah, I mean, we were in Idlib twice last year, and back then, before this offensive began, things were already very dire. Tens of thousands, in fact, hundreds of thousands of people living in makeshift refugee camps, some of them living under just a simple piece of plastic. Just to give you one example, on one trip to Idlib last year, we met a woman, a mother of 8 children, pregnant, very close to giving birth, had been told that she needed a cesarean section but had no money to go to the hospital, so told us that she was planning on giving birth on the dirt floor under that single piece of plastic under which they were all living. That was before the latest offensive. Since this offensive began, we've had hundreds of thousands of people fleeing for their lives, nearly all of them heading north, heading to where all of those people are already living in makeshift refugee camps. And they really just have one hope, that by heading north, by heading closer to the Turkish border, at least they won't be killed by airstrikes.
So
wow.
grim.
Yeah.
Holly Williams, thank you so much for your reporting. We appreciate it.